Her husband's final words were, "Don't trust the nurse." Then the autopsy disappeared. Margaret sat by Richard's bedside, her frail hand clutching his, as if willing him to stay tethered to life. His breathing was shallow now, each exhale a rasping whisper against the oppressive quiet. "Margaret," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the soft beeping of machines. His eyes fluttered open, bloodshot and clouded with pain, but still sharp enough to lock on hers. "You have to listen." She leaned closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm here, Richard. Tell me what you need." He swallowed hard, his dry lips cracking under the effort. For a moment she thought he wouldn't speak again, but then it came, faint yet unmistakable. "Don't trust the nurse." Before she could respond, his body went limp, his grip slipping from her fingers like sand through an hourglass. The machine beside them let out a single mournful wail before flatlining into silence. A nurse rushed in, a woman Margaret vaguely recognized, and began performing futile compressions on Richard's chest. But Margaret didn't move. She couldn't. Her gaze remained fixed on his face, frozen in its final expression of urgency. It wasn't until later, after the flurry of activity subsided and the doctor delivered the somber news, that Margaret found herself sitting alone in the waiting area outside the room. Her mind replayed Richard's last words over and over. "Don't trust the nurse." Who did he mean? And why? Her thoughts were interrupted when Nurse Evelyn approached, clipboard in hand. She was tall, with auburn hair pulled back into a neat bun, and carried herself with practiced composure. Too much composure, Margaret thought suddenly. Something was unsettling about how calm Evelyn seemed despite the chaos of moments ago. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Evelyn said, her tone measured and almost rehearsed. "If there's anything I can do—" Margaret cut her off abruptly. "What happened? Why did he pass so suddenly?" Evelyn hesitated only briefly, her smile never wavering. "Sometimes these things happen without warning, especially with his condition. It's tragic, but not entirely unexpected." "Not entirely unexpected." The words echoed in Margaret's ears long after Evelyn walked away. Unexpected by whom? Certainly not by Richard. He'd been acting strange for days, distracted and evasive whenever she asked about his health or treatment plan. He'd even mentioned needing to speak with someone important at the hospital, though he refused to elaborate when pressed. That night, back in the solitude of her home, Margaret sat in the dim glow of a table lamp, staring blankly at the wall. The house felt impossibly empty without Richard's presence, every creak of the floorboards magnified in the silence. She replayed their last conversation in her mind, searching for clues she might have missed, and then it hit her. The oddity she hadn't noticed until now. In the days leading up to his death, Richard had started carrying a small leather notebook everywhere he went. When she'd asked about it, he'd brushed her off with a vague excuse about jotting down reminders. But where was it now? She hadn't seen it since before he was admitted to the hospital. A chill ran down her spine as another thought surfaced. What if Richard hadn't died naturally at all? What if his cryptic warning held more truth than she wanted to believe? Margaret rose from her chair, determination replacing grief. If someone had taken Richard from her, if someone had betrayed his trust, she would find out who. Starting tomorrow, she would return to the hospital and retrace his final steps. Whatever secret Richard had been trying to protect, she owed it to him to uncover it. But first she needed answers, and she suspected Nurse Evelyn might hold the key. The next morning, Margaret returned to the hospital, her resolve hardened like steel. The sterile corridors felt colder this time, each step echoing ominously as she made her way to the administrative office. She needed answers, concrete ones, and the autopsy report seemed like the logical starting point. At the desk, a young woman with glasses too large for her face greeted her with a polite smile. "How can I assist you today?" "I'd like a copy of my husband's autopsy report," Margaret said firmly, placing Richard's death certificate on the counter. The administrator glanced at the document before typing something into her computer. Her brow furrowed slightly, and she clicked through several screens in silence. Finally, she looked up, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Grayson, but there doesn't appear to be an autopsy report on file. Margaret blinked, certain she'd misheard. What do you mean? My husband passed away unexpectedly. Surely there was an investigation. The administrator shifted uncomfortably in her chair. All procedures were followed according to protocol, ma'am. If there's no record of an autopsy, then it likely wasn't performed. But that's impossible, Margaret snapped, drawing stares from nearby patients. Lowering her voice, she leaned closer. He died under unusual circumstances. Someone should have looked into it. The administrator hesitated, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. Then, in a hushed tone, she added, Sometimes records get misplaced. It happens more often than you'd think. Misplaced. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Margaret stared at the woman, searching her face for any sign of deception. But all she saw was practiced neutrality, a mask hiding something far darker beneath. Frustrated but undeterred, Margaret left the office, her mind racing. As she turned a corner near the elevators, she nearly collided with a man carrying a worn leather briefcase. He steadied her with a firm hand, his gruff voice cutting through her thoughts. Careful there, ma'am. You look like you've got enough on your plate without adding bruises to the mix. She looked up to see a weathered face framed by salt and pepper stubble. His eyes, sharp and assessing, held decades of experience behind them. Detective Sam Callahan, he introduced himself, flashing a badge clipped to his belt. Retired, just here consulting on a case. Can I help you with something? Margaret hesitated. Something about him, his straightforward demeanor perhaps, made her want to trust him. In halting words, she explained Richard's sudden death, his cryptic warning about the nurse, and the missing autopsy report. Callahan listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying little. When she finished, he let out a low whistle. Sounds suspicious, sure, but without evidence of foul play, there's not much anyone can do. Hospitals are messy places, Mrs. Grayson. Paperwork gets lost and mistakes happen. Doesn't always mean someone's hiding something. His pragmatism stung, but Margaret refused to back down. Someone killed my husband, detective. I know it into my gut, and I intend to prove it. Callahan studied her for a moment longer, then sighed. All right, listen. I'll keep an ear out for anything unusual. No promises, though. This is your fight, not mine. Though disappointed, Margaret thanked him and left the hospital. Back home, she poured herself a cup of tea and began sorting through Richard's belongings. She hadn't touched his study since his passing, and guilt gnawed at her as she opened drawers filled with papers, pens, and old photographs. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for. Tucked inside a locked drawer, an old habit of Richard's, was the leather notebook she'd been searching for. Flipping through its pages, she discovered a series of cryptic notes scrawled in Richard's hurried handwriting, references to dates, names, and events that meant little to her at first glance. But one phrase appeared repeatedly: Medifarm litigation. Curious, Margaret booted up Richard's laptop and sifted through his files. Buried deep within folders labeled innocuously as work and miscellaneous, she found documents detailing a legal case against Medifarm, a pharmaceutical giant embroiled in accusations of malpractice. According to the files, Richard had been collecting evidence for a whistleblower lawsuit alleging the company knowingly distributed defective medications linked to patient deaths. Her hands trembled as she read further. One name stood out among the documents: Dr. Leonard Hargrove, a senior consultant at the hospital where Richard had died. According to Richard's notes, Hargrove had ties to Medifarm and had allegedly manipulated clinical trial data to cover up adverse effects. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Richard hadn't just been ill. He'd been investigating something far bigger than either of them realized. And now, whoever stood to lose from his findings had silenced him permanently. Margaret closed the laptop, her jaw set with determination. Whoever was behind this wouldn't stop with Richard. They'd come for her next if they thought she knew too much. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She picked up the phone and dialed the number Detective Callahan had scribbled on a scrap of paper. "Detective," she said when he answered, "I think it's time we had another talk." Margaret's mind wandered as she sat alone in Richard's study, the weight of his secrets pressing down on her like a storm cloud. The revelations from the previous night had left her reeling, but they also stirred memories long buried beneath the surface. Flashes of Richard's life, the parts he never fully shared, began to resurface, painting a picture that was both heroic and heartbreaking. Flashback, 15 years ago. The sun streamed through the kitchen window as Margaret flipped pancakes, humming softly to herself. Richard bustled in, tie loose around his neck, briefcase slung over one shoulder. He looked tired, dark circles underlining his eyes, but there was a fire in his gaze that made him seem invincible. "Another late night?" she asked lightly, sliding a plate across the counter. He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah. This case, it's bigger than I thought. It's not just negligence, it's systemic corruption. People are dying because these companies don't care about safety. They only care about profits." Margaret frowned, concern knitting her brow. "Be careful, Richard. These kinds of cases make enemies, powerful ones." He smiled, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "I'll be fine. Besides, someone has to stand up for the little guy, right?" Even then, she'd noticed the tension in his voice, the way he avoided meeting her eyes when discussing certain details. She told herself it was paranoia, that Richard was simply passionate about his work. But deep down, she knew he wasn't telling her everything. Present day. The memory faded, leaving Margaret staring at the notebook in her hands. Now she understood why Richard had been so secretive in the weeks leading up to his death. He hadn't wanted her involved, not out of distrust, but out of love, to protect her. But protecting her hadn't saved him. Her thoughts turned to Nurse Evelyn, whose calm demeanor now seemed less professional and more calculated. If Evelyn was connected to whatever conspiracy Richard uncovered, confronting her might be dangerous. Yet Margaret couldn't ignore the gnawing certainty that Evelyn held answers. Answers Richard had died trying to reveal. Later that afternoon, Margaret returned to the hospital, determined to face Evelyn head-on. She found her in the nurse's station, charting patient information with meticulous precision. When Evelyn looked up and saw Margaret approaching, her expression shifted subtly from neutral to guarded. "Mrs. Grayson," Evelyn said, forcing a polite smile. "Is there something I can help you with?" "I think you know why I'm here," Margaret replied, her tone steady despite the tremor in her chest. "My husband said something before he passed, something about not trusting you." Evelyn froze, pen poised midair. For a fleeting moment, her mask slipped, revealing a flicker of unease. Then, just as quickly, she recovered, setting the pen down with deliberate care. "I'm sorry to hear that," Evelyn said, her voice measured. "But I assure you I did everything I could for Mr. Grayson. Whatever he said, it wasn't about me." "You expect me to believe that?" Margaret shot back, leaning closer. "His autopsy report is missing. His death was sudden and unexplained, and you were there when it happened. Coincidence? Or are you part of something bigger?" Evelyn's composure cracked further, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned white. "You're upset. I get it. But accusing me isn't going to bring him back. If you have concerns, take them to the authorities." "Oh, I plan to," Margaret said, narrowing her eyes. "But don't think for a second I'll stop digging until I find out what happened to my husband." For a split second, Evelyn's gaze darted toward the hallway, as if checking for witnesses. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Margaret standing alone in the sterile corridor. As she watched Evelyn disappear around the corner, Margaret felt a surge of resolve mixed with unease. Evelyn's reaction had confirmed one thing. She knew more than she was letting on. Whether she was directly involved or merely complicit remained unclear. But Margaret intended to find out. On her way out of the hospital, she spotted Detective Callahan lingering near the entrance, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. He raised an eyebrow when he saw her. "Thought you'd given up already," he said gruffly. "Not even close," Margaret replied, her voice firm. "Something's happening here, Detective. Something big, and I won't rest until I expose it." Callahan studied her for a moment, then sighed. "All right, Mrs. Grayson. Let's say I agree to help. Where do we start?" Margaret handed him a folded piece of paper containing the name Dr. Leonard Hargrove and a list of suspicious dates culled from Richard's notes. "We start with him. Callahan glanced at the paper, his expression hardening. This guy's trouble. You sure you're ready for what comes next? Margaret met his gaze, unwavering. I didn't come this far to turn back now. And with that, the two set off into the shadows of Richard's past, unaware of the dangers lurking ahead, or how far some would go to keep their secrets buried. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as Margaret climbed into Detective Callahan's weathered sedan. He adjusted the rearview mirror with a grunt, his expression inscrutable but tinged with reluctant curiosity. All right, he said, pulling onto the main road. Let's get one thing straight. I'm not promising miracles here. If this Hargrove guy's dirty, he's probably got layers of protection we can't even see yet. I understand, Margaret replied firmly, clutching Richard's notebook in her lap like a talisman. But I need to know the truth. For Richard, Callahan glanced at her briefly before returning his focus to the road. Fair enough. Just don't do anything reckless. We're walking a fine line here. Their first stop was Dr. Leonard Hargrove's office, a sleek, modern suite tucked away on the top floor of the hospital. The secretary greeted them with a practiced smile, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease when she announced their arrival. Moments later, they were ushered into Hargrove's domain. Dr. Hargrove rose from behind his desk, exuding an air of polished confidence that seemed almost too perfect. His tailored suit and warm handshake radiated charm. But something was calculating in it, screamed to distrust him, his gaze, like a predator sizing up its prey. Detective Callahan, he said smoothly, extending his hand. And Mrs. Grayson, I presume? My condolences for your loss. Margaret forced herself to nod politely, though every instinct. Thank you, doctor. We're trying to piece together what happened to my husband. You worked closely with him during his treatment, didn't you? Hargrove gestured for them to sit, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Yes, briefly. Mr. Grayson was a remarkable man, dedicated, intelligent. It's tragic how things turned out. Callahan leaned forward slightly, his gruff voice cutting through the pleasantries. Any idea why his autopsy report seems to have vanished? Or why certain records related to his care are inconsistent? Hargrove's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. Bureaucracy at its finest. Hospitals deal with thousands of patients daily. It's easy for paperwork to slip through the cracks. Surely you've encountered similar issues in your line of work, Detective. Callahan's jaw tightened, but he didn't press further. Instead, he let Margaret take the lead. She opened Richard's notebook to a marked page filled with dates and cryptic references. These dates, she began, sliding the book toward Hargrove. Do any of them ring a bell? They correspond to times when Richard mentioned feeling unusually fatigued or experiencing side effects after treatments. Hargrove skimmed the entries casually, his demeanor unchanged. I'm afraid these could refer to anything. Routine medications, therapy sessions, even unrelated health concerns. Without context, it's hard to say. Margaret studied his face intently, searching for cracks in his polished facade. What about clinical trials? Were there any unauthorized procedures happening under your supervision? This time, Hargrove's reaction was more pronounced. His fingers twitched against the edge of the desk, and his smile thinned ever so slightly. Unauthorized procedures? That's quite the accusation, Mrs. Grayson. I assure you, everything conducted here follows strict ethical guidelines. Callahan interjected, his tone sharper now. Funny thing is, Doc, we've been hearing rumors otherwise. Some folks claim certain trials weren't exactly above board. Care to comment? Hargrove stood abruptly, signaling the end of their meeting. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, by all means present it. Until then, I suggest focusing your efforts elsewhere. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have patients to attend to. As they left the office, Margaret felt a chill settle over her. Hargrove's calm denial only deepened her suspicions. Something or someone was protecting him. Back at Richard's study that evening, Margaret continued sifting through his files. Hidden among encrypted folders, she discovered a series of emails between Richard and an anonymous whistleblower using the alias Watcher. The exchanges painted a damning picture. Watcher claimed that MediPharm had been conducting illegal clinical trials within the hospital, testing experimental drugs on unsuspecting patients without proper consent. Richard had been gathering evidence to expose the operation, including falsified trial data and internal memos implicating key figures like Hargrove. One email stood out in particular. Watcher. Be careful, Richard. These people will stop at nothing to protect themselves. Don't trust anyone. Richard. Understood. But silence isn't an option anymore. Lives depend on this. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she read the words. Richard had known the risks, and still he'd chosen to fight. Determined to follow the trail, Margaret spent the next few days visiting other staff members who might have witnessed suspicious activity. Each conversation revealed fragments of information, but also brought hostility from those loyal to Hargrove or employed by Medifarm. A nurse named Clara admitted seeing late-night deliveries of unmarked crates to restricted areas of the hospital, but refused to elaborate, citing fear of retaliation. Another staffer hinted at whispered arguments between Hargrove and Evelyn, but clammed up when pressed for details. Word of Margaret's investigation spread quickly, and soon she noticed strangers lingering outside her home or following her car. Anonymous notes appeared on her doorstep, warning her to back off or face consequences. Yet despite the mounting pressure, Margaret refused to yield. Late one night, as rain lashed against her windows, Margaret sat alone at Richard's desk, staring at the growing web of connections she'd mapped out. At the center of it all was Dr. Leonard Hargrove, a man whose charm masked a dangerous secret. She picked up her phone and dialed Callahan. "We need to move faster," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging both outside and within. "They know we're on to them, and if we don't act soon, they'll destroy everything Richard fought for." On the other end of the line, Callahan sighed heavily. "Then buckle up, Mrs. Grayson, because once we step into the lion's den, there's no turning back." Together they prepared for the next phase of their investigation, unaware of the deadly game waiting to ensnare them both. The scent of old paper and dust filled the air as Margaret knelt beside a weathered metal file cabinet tucked into the corner of Richard's office. She had avoided this part of his workspace for days, dreading what it might hold. But now, driven by desperation and resolve, she turned the small brass key she'd found taped beneath the desk drawer. The lock clicked open with a soft groan, revealing a trove of meticulously organized folders and documents. Each label was written in Richard's precise handwriting. Medifarm trials, Hargrove correspondence, anonymous tips. Her heart raced as she pulled out the first folder, its contents spilling onto her lap like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Inside were damning records, emails, memos, and clinical trial data exposing Medifarm's unethical practices. Falsified results showing experimental drugs as safe when they were anything but. Patient consent forms signed under dubious circumstances, or not at all. And most chillingly, internal communications implicating Dr. Leonard Hargrove as the linchpin of the operation. But one item caught her attention more than the others. A plain white envelope marked simply, "For Margaret." Her hands trembled as she opened it, pulling out a single sheet of paper covered in Richard's familiar scrawl. "Dear Margaret, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I tried to protect you, but now I fear my efforts may have put you in greater danger. Please listen carefully. Don't trust anyone close to me. Not colleagues, not friends, not even—" The letter ended abruptly, mid-sentence, leaving an unsettling void where answers should have been. Margaret stared at the page, her mind reeling. Who had interrupted him? Had he known his time was running out? She read the words again, searching for hidden meaning. Don't trust anyone close to me. Close to him. Did that include Detective Callahan? Nurse Evelyn? Or someone else entirely? Her thoughts churned as she sifted through the remaining files. Among them was a map of the hospital basement, marked with red X's near storage rooms and maintenance corridors. A note scribbled in the margin read, "Unmarked crates arrive here after hours. Watcher mentioned midnight shifts." Midnight shifts. The phrase sent a shiver down her spine. Whatever Richard had uncovered, it wasn't just paperwork. It was tangible evidence being moved under cover of darkness. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret spread the documents across her dining table, piecing together the fragments of Richard's investigation. The picture emerging was horrifying. A network of corruption stretching from corporate boardrooms to hospital wards, endangering countless lives in pursuit of profit. And yet there were still gaps, questions only Richard could have answered. Why hadn't he finished the letter? What had he meant to say before stopping so suddenly? Her gaze fell on the map of the hospital basement. If the unmarked crates contained proof of illegal activity, then finding them might be the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. But going alone was too risky. She needed help. But whom could she trust? Detective Callahan came to mind immediately. Gruff and skeptical though he was, he'd shown genuine interest in uncovering the truth. Still, Richard's warning echoed in her mind. Don't trust anyone close to me. Was Callahan truly on her side? Or was he another pawn in this twisted game? Deciding caution was paramount, Margaret resolved to act carefully. First, she would gather more information about the midnight deliveries. Then, if necessary, she'd confront Callahan directly, but only after ensuring his loyalty. Early the next morning, Margaret returned to the hospital under the pretense of retrieving personal items from Richard's locker. Instead, she made her way to the basement, guided by the map. The dimly lit corridors smelled of damp concrete and rust, their silence broken only by the hum of distant machinery. Following the red X's, she reached a heavy steel door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Peering through a cracked window, she saw rows of crates stacked neatly against the walls. Some bore labels, others were blank, their contents obscured by thick plastic wrapping. As she stood there weighing whether to investigate further, footsteps echoed behind her. Heart pounding, she ducked into a nearby alcove, pressing herself against the cold wall. A figure appeared, a man in scrubs, wheeling a cart laden with supplies. He paused briefly, glanced around, then entered the storage room, closing the door behind him. Margaret waited until the sound of his movements faded before slipping away, her pulse racing. She didn't dare risk discovery. Not yet, but she had seen enough to confirm her suspicions. Those crates held secrets worth killing for. Back home, Margaret called Callahan, keeping her tone neutral. "We need to meet," she said. "I found something important, something we can't ignore." Callahan hesitated. "Where?" "The cafe on Main Street. Noon sharp." As she hung up, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows seemed to linger too long outside her windows, and every creak of the floorboards felt deliberate. Whoever was involved in this conspiracy wasn't going to let her dig much deeper without a fight. Still, fear wouldn't stop her. Richard had sacrificed everything to expose the truth, and now it was her turn to carry the torch. No matter the cost. The salty breeze carried whispers of the past as Margaret walked along the weathered boardwalk that hugged the edge of their small coastal town. This place had been her home for decades, a community where everyone knew each other's names, faces, and secrets. Or so they thought. Now those same bonds of familiarity felt like chains binding her to a web of lies. The closer she got to unraveling Richard's death, the more she realized how deeply entangled this conspiracy was in the fabric of their lives. Flashback. 10 years ago, Margaret stood on the porch of their modest beachfront house, watching Richard pace back and forth with a phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low but urgent, his free hand gesturing emphatically. "They're not just unethical, they're dangerous," he said, pausing only to glance over his shoulder at her. "If we don't stop them, people will die." She didn't ask who they were. She already knew. It wasn't the first time Richard had taken on powerful adversaries, nor would it be the last. But something about this case felt different, darker. Later that evening, after hanging up the call, Richard joined her on the couch, his expression heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Do you ever wonder if we've made enemies without realizing it?" he asked quietly. Margaret frowned, resting a hand on his knee. "You mean because of your work?" He nodded, staring into the distance. "This town, it's smaller than it seems. Everyone's connected somehow. Sometimes I think our neighbors know more than they let on. Or worse, that they're complicit." At the time, she dismissed his concerns as paranoia brought on by stress. Now she wondered if he'd seen ghosts lurking in plain sight all along. Present day. Margaret visited several of Richard's old colleagues and friends over the next few days, seeking answers hidden in fragments of conversation. Each meeting revealed new insights into the man he'd become in his final months, and the fears that haunted him. One such visit took her to the home of Harold Bennett, a retired judge and one of Richard's closest confidants. They sat together on the sun-dappled porch, sipping lemonade while seagulls cried overhead. "He came to me a few weeks ago," Harold recalled, his gravelly voice tinged with regret. "Said he'd stumbled onto something big, something that could bring down some very powerful people. He seemed scared, Margaret, not for himself, but for what might happen if he failed." "Did he mention anyone specifically?" Margaret asked, leaning forward. Harold hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "He talked about Hargrove, said the guy was slippery, always covering his tracks. And there was someone else too, a woman. I don't remember her name, but Richard said she worked at the hospital. He didn't trust her." Nurse Evelyn's face flashed in Margaret's mind, but she kept silent, letting Harold continue. "He told me he'd written everything down," Harold added, "in case anything happened to him. Told me to keep an eye on you, though I didn't realize then how serious things were." Margaret thanked him and left, her heart heavy with both gratitude and dread. Whatever Richard had documented, it had cost him his life. Her next stop was the local diner, where she met Detective Callahan over coffee. He slid a folder across the table, his expression grim. "I did some digging into the hospital's finances," he said, tapping the cover. "Turns out they've been receiving hefty donations from MediFarm for years. Off-the-books payments disguised as research grants. Looks like someone wanted to make sure the hospital stayed loyal." Margaret opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Names jumped out at her. Dr. Leonard Hargrove, Nurse Evelyn Carter, and even the hospital administrator who'd claimed Richard's autopsy report was missing. "This isn't just negligence," Callahan muttered. "It's a coordinated effort. Someone high up is pulling strings, making sure nothing gets traced back to them." Margaret nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we need to find the evidence Richard hid. Whatever's in those crates in the basement, it's the key to exposing them all." Callahan studied her for a moment, his gruff demeanor softening slightly. "You're putting yourself in real danger, Margaret. If these people are willing to kill once, they won't hesitate again." "I know," she replied, meeting his gaze. "But Richard believed in justice, even when it meant risking everything. So do I." That night, unable to sleep, Margaret wandered through the quiet halls of her home, memories swirling around her like ghosts. She thought of the townspeople she'd spoken to, their guarded expressions, their evasive answers. Were they protecting themselves or someone else? And what about Harold? Had he truly been oblivious to the extent of Richard's involvement, or had he chosen not to dig deeper? The questions gnawed at her, but one truth remained clear. Richard hadn't acted alone. Someone had helped him gather evidence, someone who called themselves Watcher. That person might still be alive, and if Margaret could find them, they might hold the final piece of the puzzle. The next morning, armed with fresh determination, Margaret returned to the hospital. This time, she wasn't alone. Callahan waited outside in his car, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. As she descended into the basement, guided once again by Richard's map, she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes watched her from the shadows. The air grew colder, heavier, as she approached the storage room. The steel door creaked open, revealing rows of crates stacked neatly against the walls. Her flashlight beam danced across their surfaces, searching for markings or labels. Then, tucked behind a stack near the far corner, she found it, a crate marked with Richard's initials. Heart pounding, she pried it open, revealing folders, flash drives, and a single note addressed to her. "Trust no one," it read, "not even me." Before she could process the cryptic message, a sound echoed from behind her, a soft footstep, followed by the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. Margaret froze, raising her hand slowly. "Who's there?" A familiar voice answered, cold and sharp. "You shouldn't have come here, Margaret." And as the figure stepped into the light, Margaret realized the truth. The enemy had been closer than she'd ever imagined. The rain hammered against the windshield as Margaret and Detective Callahan drove to a nondescript apartment complex on the outskirts of town. Sarah Bennett, a former MediFarm employee turned whistleblower, had agreed to meet them, but only under strict conditions. No police involvement, no recording devices, and complete anonymity. Margaret glanced at Callahan, who sat silently beside her, his jaw clenched with tension. "Are you sure about this?" he asked for the third time since they left the hospital. "No," she admitted, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "But if Sarah knows something about Richard's investigation, we can't afford to ignore it." Callahan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Just promise me you won't do anything reckless. We're walking into dangerous territory here." "I'll be careful," Margaret assured him, though her tone betrayed her resolve. Careful or not, she was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant staring down the barrel of danger herself. Sarah greeted them at the door, her wary eyes scanning the hallway before ushering them inside. She was younger than Margaret had expected, mid-30s perhaps, with dark circles under her eyes and an air of perpetual exhaustion. The small apartment was sparsely furnished, the walls bare except for a single-framed photograph of a young girl sitting on a park bench. "Thank you for seeing us," Margaret began, taking a seat at the cluttered kitchen table. Sarah nodded curtly, wrapping her arms around herself as if shielding against the cold. "You said you knew Richard Grayson. What do you want to know?" Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Before he died, Richard uncovered evidence of illegal clinical trials being conducted in the hospital. He was working with someone, a whistleblower. Was that you?" For a moment, Sarah said nothing, her gaze fixed on the floor. Then slowly she nodded. "Yes. I reached out to him months ago, after discovering what MediPharm was doing. They were testing experimental drugs on patients without their consent, falsifying trial results to cover up side effects. People got sick. Some even died. And when I tried to report it, they threatened my family." Her voice broke, and she paused to steady herself. "Richard promised he could protect me. He said he'd expose everything. The trials, the corruption, the lies. But what?" Margaret prompted gently. "But now he's dead," Sarah finished, her eyes brimming with tears. "And whoever killed him is still out there." Detective Callahan leaned forward, his gruff demeanor softening slightly. "Did Richard tell you anything specific? Names, dates, locations?" Sarah shook her head. "He kept most of the details to himself, said it was safer that way. But he mentioned Dr. Leonard Hargrove a lot. Said Hargrove was deep in bed with MediPharm, manipulating data to make the drugs look safe. There were others too, higher-ups at the company, people with money and power. Whoever they are, they'll stop at nothing to protect themselves." Margaret exchanged a glance with Callahan, her heart pounding. This was it, the confirmation they needed. Richard hadn't been imagining conspiracies. He'd stumbled onto a deadly web of deceit. "What about Nurse Evelyn?" Margaret asked suddenly. "Did Richard ever mention her?" Sarah frowned, thinking. "Not directly, but he did say there was someone at the hospital he didn't trust. Someone close to Hargrove." The pieces clicked into place in Margaret's mind. Evelyn wasn't just complicit. She was part of the inner circle, helping Hargrove maintain control over the operation. As the storm outside intensified, Sarah handed Margaret a flash drive containing documents and emails she'd managed to save before fleeing MediPharm. "This is everything I have," she said quietly. "It's not much, but it might help you prove what they've done." Margaret accepted the drive with trembling hands. "Why are you risking so much to help us?" "Because Richard believed in doing the right thing," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "And because I owe it to the people who suffered because of these monsters. If you can bring them down, then maybe my daughter will grow up in a better world." Back in the car, Margaret stared at the flash drive, her thoughts racing. With this new evidence, they finally had a chance to expose the conspiracy, but it wouldn't be easy. Every step forward felt like stepping deeper into quicksand, the weight of danger pressing heavier with each revelation. "We need to move fast," Callahan said, breaking the silence. "If word gets out that we're onto them, they'll destroy any remaining evidence, and anyone standing in their way." Margaret nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then let's finish what Richard started." Callahan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You realize how risky this is, right? These people aren't amateurs. They've got resources, connections, and no moral compass. Taking them down won't just put your life in danger. It'll shake this entire town to its core. I know, Margaret replied, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. But Richard gave his life trying to stop them. I won't let his sacrifice be in vain. That night, armed with Sarah's flash drive and Richard's notes, Margaret and Callahan began piecing together the final puzzle. The trail led straight to the highest levels of Medifarm and the hospital administration, implicating not only Hargrove and Evelyn, but also several unnamed executives whose names appeared repeatedly in encrypted files. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Margaret made a decision. It was time to confront those responsible, not just for Richard's death, but for the countless lives destroyed by their greed. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she'd memorized days ago. When the call connected, she spoke with quiet determination. It's time, she said. We're going public. On the other end, a journalist friend agreed to meet her at a secure location later that day. Together, they would release the evidence to the world, exposing the conspiracy once and for all. But as Margaret hung up, a shadow passed across her living room window. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the rain, watching her. Turning off the lights, she moved cautiously toward the door, her heart hammering in her chest. Whoever it was, they already knew she was onto them, and now they were coming for her. The hospital corridor felt colder than ever as Margaret approached the nurse's station, her footsteps echoing like a metronome, counting down to confrontation. Nurse Evelyn stood at the counter, organizing charts with mechanical precision. When she looked up and saw Margaret approaching, her composure faltered just for a moment, but it was enough. Mrs. Grayson, Evelyn said, forcing a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. I wasn't expecting to see you again. We need to talk, Margaret replied, her voice low but unyielding. She glanced around, noting the absence of other staff nearby. Somewhere private. Evelyn hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, leading Margaret to an empty supply room. The space smelled faintly of antiseptic and latex, the fluorescent light casting harsh shadows across Evelyn's face. What is this about? Evelyn asked, crossing her arms defensively. You know exactly what this is about, Margaret shot back, closing the door behind them. Richard's death, the missing autopsy report, the illegal trials. You're involved, Evelyn. I want to know how deep you're in and who put you there. Evelyn's mask cracked, panic flickering in her wide eyes. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Margaret snapped, stepping closer until they were nearly face to face. You administered a fatal dose of medication to my husband, didn't you? That's why he died so suddenly. That's why his last words were, don't trust the nurse. Evelyn stumbled back, her shoulders hitting the wall. Her breath came in shallow gasps as tears welled in her eyes. For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze darting toward the door as if considering escape. Then finally, she broke. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling. I gave him the injection, but I swear I had no choice. No choice? Margaret repeated, incredulous. You killed my husband. He told me to do it, Evelyn cried, her composure crumbling entirely. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she slid to the floor, wrapping her arms around herself. Dr. Hargrove, he said if I refused, she trailed off, choking on a sob. Margaret crouched beside her, torn between fury and disbelief. Start from the beginning. Tell me everything. Evelyn took a shaky breath, wiping her face with shaking hands. It started months ago. Dr. Hargrove brought me into his confidence, said he needed someone he could trust to handle certain sensitive matters. At first it seemed harmless, adjusting records, covering small mistakes. But then it got worse. Experimental drugs are being tested without consent. Patients are dying under mysterious circumstances. And Richard, he found out. He was going to expose everything. So Hargrove ordered you to kill him? Margaret demanded, her voice sharp with accusation. Evelyn shook her head vehemently. No, not directly. He never said those exact words. But he made it clear what would happen if Richard went public. He threatened my family, Margaret. My little sister. She's only 16. They knew where she went to school, where she walked home every day. Her voice broke and she buried her face in her hands. Margaret watched her, her anger warring with pity. Evelyn wasn't innocent, far from it, but she was also a pawn in a much larger game. What about the cover-up? Margaret pressed. The missing autopsy report? Did Hargrove arrange all of that too? Evelyn nodded, her expression hollow. He has connections everywhere. Doctors, administrators, and even people outside the hospital. They erased every trace of what happened to Richard. No one questions him, not here anyway. And you? Margaret asked softly. Are you willing to testify against him? To tell the truth about what happened? Evelyn froze, terror flashing in her eyes. I can't, she whispered. If I do, they'll come after me, after my family. Please, you have to understand. I'm trapped. Margaret straightened, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to scream, to demand justice for Richard, no matter the cost. But another part recognized Evelyn's fear, the same fear that had driven Richard to warn her before his death. I won't force you to testify, Margaret said finally, her tone firm but not unkind. But I will stop them, all of them. And when I do, maybe you'll finally be free. Evelyn stared at her, tears streaming silently down her face. You're braver than I am, she murmured. But be careful, Mrs. Grayson. These people, they're monsters. They won't hesitate to destroy anyone who stands in their way. As Margaret left the supply room, her mind raced with possibilities. Evelyn's confession confirmed what she'd suspected all along. Dr. Leonard Hargrove was at the center of the conspiracy, but exposing him wouldn't be easy, not with his network of protectors and enablers shielding him at every turn. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick message to Detective Callahan. We need to act fast. Hargrove's our man. Within minutes, he responded, meet me at the precinct. We'll plan our next move. Margaret paused outside the hospital doors, glancing back at the towering building one last time. Somewhere inside, Dr. Hargrove continued his charade, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. Soon, she thought grimly, the world would see him for what he truly was, a predator hiding behind a white coat. And when they did, she would make sure Richard's name was remembered, not as a victim, but as a hero who refused to stay silent. With that resolve burning in her chest, Margaret stepped into the sunlight, ready to face whatever came next. The precinct's dimly lit conference room buzzed with quiet urgency as Margaret and Detective Callahan spread out the evidence they'd amassed against Dr. Leonard Hargrove. Photographs, financial records, encrypted emails, all pointed to one man at the center of a sprawling web of corruption. Callahan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he studied the documents. This is worse than I thought, he muttered. Hargrove didn't just facilitate these trials, he profited from them. Look at these transfers. He tapped a printed bank statement showing large sums deposited into offshore accounts linked to Hargrove's name. Margaret nodded grimly, her fingers tracing the edges of Richard's notebook. He used his position to cover up everything. Patients dying mysteriously, falsified trial results, bribes to hospital staff, and now we know why he silenced Richard to protect himself. But exposing him won't be easy, Callahan warned. These kinds of people don't operate alone. They have layers of protection, lawyers, politicians, maybe even law enforcement on their payroll. Margaret met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. Then we'll cut through every layer until there's nothing left to hide. Later that evening, sitting alone in Richard's study, Margaret allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She sifted through old photographs and mementos, her mind drifting back to interactions she'd had with Dr. Hargrove over the years. At charity galas, community events, even casual encounters in the hospital hallway, Hargrove had always been charming, affable, the picture of professionalism. He'd asked about her garden, complimented her cooking, and joked with Richard about golf games they never quite managed to play. How easily he deceived everyone, she thought bitterly. Beneath that polished exterior lay a calculating predator who manipulated lives as casually as others might move chess pieces across a board. Her thoughts turned to Evelyn, whose tearful confession still weighed heavily on her conscience. Evelyn wasn't innocent, but she was also a victim, a cog in Hargrove's machine, forced to choose between complicity and annihilation. How many others were trapped in similar ways? Margaret clenched her fists, anger simmering beneath her grief. For every life lost to greed and corruption, for every lie told to maintain power, justice would come, even if it cost her everything. The next morning, Margaret stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper from her driveway. As she bent down, something caught her eye. A plain white envelope tucked beneath the welcome mat. Her pulse quickened as she picked it up, tearing it open with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing 3 chilling words. Stop digging deeper. No signature, no explanation. Just a threat, stark and unambiguous. For a moment, fear clawed at her chest, icy tendrils wrapping around her heart. But then she remembered Richard's determination, his refusal to back down despite knowing the risks. If he could face death head-on for the sake of truth, so could she. She called Callahan immediately. "Someone left a warning at my house," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "They're watching me." "Damn it," Callahan growled. "You need to stay safe, Margaret. Let me send someone over." "No," she interrupted firmly. "If they think they've scared me off, they'll get careless. We keep moving forward." Callahan hesitated, then sighed. "All right, but promise me you'll take precautions. These people are dangerous." "I will," she assured him, "and I'll make sure they regret underestimating me." That afternoon, armed with newfound resolve, Margaret returned to the hospital. She knew confronting Hargrove directly was risky, but time was running out. Every day they delayed gave him another chance to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. She found him in his office, seated behind his desk with an air of practiced calm. His smile faltered slightly when he saw her standing in the doorway, but he recovered quickly, rising to greet her. "Mrs. Grayson," he said smoothly, extending a hand, "what brings you here today?" Margaret ignored the gesture, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "We need to talk, Dr. Hargrove. About Richard." His expression shifted subtly, a flicker of unease betraying his otherwise composed facade. "Of course. Please, sit down." "I'd rather stand," Margaret replied coolly. "I've uncovered some troubling information lately. About illegal clinical trials, payments made to certain individuals, fatal doses administered under duress." Hargrove's smile vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to," he said, his tone measured but edged with menace. "Don't insult my intelligence," Margaret snapped. "You orchestrated Richard's death to protect your secrets. You coerced Evelyn into administering the fatal dose, and you spent years covering up the truth while innocent people suffered." Hargrove crossed his arms, leaning casually against his desk, as if unfazed. "Even if any of that were true, which it isn't, you have no proof. No credible witness willing to testify. Nothing but hearsay and speculation." "You underestimate me," Margaret countered, her voice firm. "I have Sarah Bennett's testimony, financial records linking you to Medifarm, evidence hidden in Richard's files, and soon the whole world will see you for what you truly are." For the first time, Hargrove's composure cracked. A muscle twitched in his jaw, and his eyes narrowed dangerously. "Be careful, Mrs. Grayson. People who dig too deeply often find themselves buried alongside their discoveries." "It's too late for threats," Margaret said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Your web is unraveling, Dr. Hargrove, and when it collapses, you'll go down with it." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out, leaving Hargrove standing in silence. As she exited the hospital, she felt a strange mix of exhilaration and dread. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back now. That night, as Margaret reviewed the evidence one final time, she realized the enormity of what lay ahead. Exposing Hargrove wouldn't just bring justice for Richard, it would dismantle a system built on lies and exploitation. But dismantling such a system came at a price, and Margaret was prepared to pay it. For Richard, for the victims, for the truth. Whatever happened next, she would face it head-on. The air in Dr. Leonard Hargrove's office was thick with tension as Margaret stood across from him, her hands gripping the edge of his desk. On its surface lay a dossier of damning evidence, Bank statements, encrypted emails, Sarah Bennett's testimony, and Richard's meticulously documented notes. Each piece of the puzzle told a story of greed, manipulation, and death. Hargrove sat back in his chair, his usual charm replaced by a cold, calculating glare. For once, he wasn't smiling. "You've made a grave mistake coming here," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "No," Margaret replied, her tone unwavering. "The only mistake was yours. You underestimated Richard, and you underestimated me." She slid the documents toward him, watching as his eyes flickered over their contents. His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny what they revealed. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Let's say, hypothetically, that some of this is true," he began, his tone almost conversational. "Do you really think I did it for personal gain? For money?" He shook his head dismissively. "I did it because I believe in progress, Mrs. Grayson. Medical advancements require sacrifices. Without risks, there can be no breakthroughs." "Sacrifices?" Margaret repeated, her voice rising with fury. "You call experimenting on innocent people without their consent a sacrifice. You poisoned them, lied to them, and when anyone tried to expose you, you silenced them. That's not progress, it's murder." Hargrove's expression darkened, the mask of civility slipping further. "You wouldn't understand. People like you, ordinary people, don't grasp the complexities of science. Sometimes difficult choices must be made for the greater good." "The greater good?" Margaret shot back, her voice shaking with emotion. "Richard believed in justice, in doing what was right, even when it cost him everything. And now, thanks to your greater good, he's dead." For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then Hargrove spoke again, his voice tinged with something resembling regret, but also defiance. "Your husband was persistent," he admitted reluctantly. "He dug too deep, uncovered things he shouldn't have. I warned him to stop, but he refused. What was I supposed to do? Let him ruin years of research? Destroy lives that could have been saved?" Margaret stared at him, incredulous. "You honestly believe that twisted logic? That killing Richard somehow justified the suffering of others?" "It's not about justification," Hargrove snapped, losing his composure for the first time. "It's about survival. If word got out about the trials, if the public learned how many patients died during testing, the entire project would collapse. Millions invested, decades of work, all gone. Do you think MediPharm cares about ethics? They wanted results, and I delivered them. End of story." His words sent a chill down Margaret's spine. This wasn't just about Hargrove or even MediPharm. It was part of something much larger, a system built on exploitation and lies. "And Evelyn?" she pressed, refusing to let him evade accountability. "Did she deserve to live in fear for her life? To carry the guilt of murdering my husband?" Hargrove shrugged, his indifference chilling. "She knew the risks. Everyone involved did. Collateral damage, Mrs. Grayson. Unfortunate but necessary." The phrase struck Margaret like a physical blow. Collateral damage. That's what Richard had been to him. Not a man, not a husband, but an obstacle to be removed. Before she could respond, Hargrove leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "But tell me this. What happens when the truth comes out? When the world sees how far we've gone to save lives? Will they thank us for our sacrifices? Or will they crucify us for doing what needed to be done?" "They'll see you for what you are," Margaret said firmly, "a monster hiding behind excuses. And they'll make sure you never hurt anyone again." Hargrove smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You're naive if you think exposing me will change anything. There are others, dozens of them, who will pick up where I left off. The machine keeps running, Mrs. Grayson. Even without me." His arrogance ignited a spark of determination within her. "Maybe so, but today the machine stops running through you." As if on cue, the door burst open and Detective Callahan strode in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. In his hand, he held a warrant for Hargrove's arrest. "Dr. Leonard Hargrove," Callahan announced, his gruff voice cutting through the room, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Hargrove rose slowly, his expression unreadable. As the officers cuffed him, he turned to Margaret, his gaze piercing. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You may have won this round, but the war hasn't ended." Margaret met his stare without flinching. "Then consider this the start of something new." Outside the hospital, reporters swarmed the entrance, cameras flashing as Hargrove was led away in handcuffs. Margaret stood at a distance, watching silently as the man who had orchestrated so much pain was finally brought to justice. Callahan joined her, his expression weary but satisfied. "You did it, Margaret. You took him down." She nodded, though her heart felt heavy. Justice for Richard was bittersweet. Nothing could bring him back, but knowing his death hadn't been in vain, that his fight had mattered, gave her a measure of peace. "What happens next?" she asked softly. "We build a case," Callahan replied. "Expose the rest of the conspiracy. It won't be easy, but with the evidence we've gathered, we can take down Medifarm and everyone else involved." Margaret looked out at the crowd, her resolve hardening. This victory was only the beginning. There were still secrets to uncover, truths to reveal, and lives to honor. And she intended to see it through. To the very end, the small coastal town buzzed with a mix of shock and vindication in the weeks following Dr. Leonard Hargrove's arrest. Headlines blared across local newspapers, detailing the web of corruption that had been exposed. "Hospital doctor arrested in illegal drug trial scandal," one read. Another proclaimed, "Justice for victims of medical malpractice." For Margaret, the public outcry was both validating and overwhelming. Strangers approached her at the grocery store, on the boardwalk, even at Richard's gravesite, offering condolences and gratitude. "Your husband was a hero," they'd say. "Thank you for standing up to them." But while the community rallied around her, Margaret couldn't escape the ache in her heart. The applause felt hollow without Richard by her side to share it. Courtroom testimony. Margaret stood before the packed courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she recounted Richard's final days. Her voice trembled at times, but she refused to falter. This was his moment, his chance to be remembered, not as a victim, but as a man who had fought tirelessly for justice. Richard uncovered evidence of illegal clinical trials being conducted secretly within the hospital, she explained, addressing the jury. He believed these trials put patients' lives at risk and sought to expose the truth. But instead, he became a target. Someone silenced him to protect their secrets. She paused, glancing down at Richard's notebook, which lay open on the witness stand. Its pages were worn from months of handling, each entry a testament to his determination. "When I found this," she continued, her voice thick with emotion, "I realized I couldn't let his death be in vain. He trusted me to carry the torch, to finish what he started, and that's exactly what I intend to do." The courtroom fell silent as her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Even the defense attorneys seemed momentarily subdued, unable to argue against the raw sincerity of her testimony. Afterward, Detective Callahan met her outside the courthouse, his expression softer than usual. "You did good in there," he said, offering a rare smile. Richard would have been proud. Margaret nodded, blinking back tears. "Thank you, Detective, for everything." Callahan hesitated, then added, "You know, most people wouldn't have had the guts to go up against someone like Hargrove. You didn't just solve this case. You changed the game. Because of you, others will be safer." His words brought a flicker of warmth to her chest, though grief still lingered beneath the surface. She knew Richard's legacy would live on, not just in the reforms implemented to prevent future abuses, but in the courage he inspired in those who came after him. Reforms and accountability. In the months that followed, the scandal sent shockwaves through the medical and pharmaceutical industries. Medifarm faced a barrage of lawsuits from families of victims, many of whom had lost loved ones to the experimental drugs. Public outrage forced regulatory agencies to tighten oversight, implementing stricter guidelines for clinical trials and patient consent. Locally, the hospital underwent sweeping changes. New leadership replaced those implicated in the conspiracy, and an independent ethics board was established to monitor research practices. A memorial garden was dedicated to the patients who had unknowingly sacrificed their lives in the name of profit, a somber reminder of the cost of unchecked ambition. Margaret attended the dedication ceremony, standing quietly among the crowd as speakers honored the memory of those affected. As she laid a single white rose at the base of the monument, she whispered a silent promise to Richard. "I won't stop fighting," she murmured, "not until every last piece of this darkness is brought into the light." Grappling with loss. Despite the progress made, Margaret struggled to reconcile the sense of triumph with the emptiness left by Richard's absence. Nights were hardest. The quiet of their home echoed with memories of laughter and shared dreams now out of reach. One evening, as she sat alone in his study, she opened the letter he had written shortly before his death, the one that ended abruptly. Rereading the words, she noticed something she hadn't before. A faint pencil mark beneath the final line. Holding it up to the light, she saw faint indentations where Richard had written additional text, erased hastily but not completely. Using a soft cloth, she gently traced the impressions, revealing 4 previously hidden words. "Trust yourself. You're stronger than you know." Tears streamed down her face as the full weight of his message sank in. He hadn't just warned her, he'd prepared her, believed in her, trusted her to continue the fight when he no longer could. With renewed resolve, Margaret tucked the letter safely away, vowing to honor his faith in her. Though the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, she knew she wasn't alone. Richard's spirit guided her, fueling her determination to ensure no one else suffered as they had. A new beginning. By spring, life in the small coastal town began to heal. The scars remained, but so did the hope that justice could prevail, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Margaret took solace in small victories. Letters from strangers thanking her for inspiring change. The sight of daffodils blooming along the cliffs. The sound of waves crashing against the shore. Each reminded her of Richard's enduring presence in her life. One crisp morning, as she walked along the beach, she paused to watch the sunrise. Golden light spilled across the horizon, casting shadows that danced like whispers of the past. "I miss you," she whispered, her voice carried away by the breeze. "But I'll keep going, for you, for us, for everyone who deserves better." And with that, she turned toward home, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The morning air was crisp as Margaret made her way through the quiet cemetery, her footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers, daisies, lavender, and sprigs of rosemary, each chosen for its meaning, remembrance, devotion, and strength. Richard's headstone stood beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree, its surface weathered but still bearing his name in bold, elegant script. She knelt before it, placing the flowers gently at its base. For a long moment, she simply sat there, letting the silence envelop her. "I trusted you," she whispered finally, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Even when I didn't understand what you were trying to tell me, I trusted you." Her fingers brushed the cool stone, tracing the letters of his name. The weight of his absence still lingered, but it no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it had become a quiet presence, a reminder of the love they'd shared and the fight he'd inspired her to carry on. "You always believed I was stronger than I thought," she continued, smiling faintly through her tears. "And maybe I am. Because of you, I found a courage I never knew I had." She leaned back, resting her hands on her knees as she gazed up at the sky. The sun peeked over the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of gold and pink. It was a new day, not just for her, but for everyone who had been touched by Richard's legacy. In the months since Hargrove's arrest, Margaret had dedicated herself to ensuring that his death wouldn't be forgotten. She became an outspoken advocate for patients' rights, traveling to conferences, and speaking engagements to share Richard's story and warn against the dangers of unchecked corporate greed in healthcare. Her efforts weren't without resistance. Some accused her of being too radical, others dismissed her as a grieving widow clinging to anger. But Margaret refused to back down. Every speech, every article, Every meeting with lawmakers brought her one step closer to creating a world where tragedies like Richard's could never happen again. At first, the work consumed her, filling the void left by his loss. But slowly, she began to find balance. Friends and neighbors rallied around her, offering support and encouragement. Even Detective Callahan checked in occasionally, his gruff demeanor masking a genuine fondness for the woman who had changed the course of justice in their town. "Don't forget to take care of yourself," he'd said during one of their conversations. "Richard wouldn't want you burning out trying to save the world all at once." He was right, of course. Justice wasn't something that could be achieved overnight. It was a lifelong commitment, much like the love she and Richard had shared. And so Margaret learned to pace herself, finding joy in small victories and moments of peace amidst the chaos. As the seasons changed, so did Margaret. She rediscovered hobbies she'd set aside in the wake of Richard's death, painting seascapes, tending to her garden, walking along the beach at dawn. Each activity brought a sense of renewal, a reminder that life continued even after loss. One particularly clear morning, she rose early, drawn to the ocean as if by instinct. The tide was low, leaving behind shimmering pools of water that reflected the rising sun. She walked barefoot along the shoreline, feeling the cool sand between her toes and listening to the rhythmic crash of waves. Standing at the edge of the cliffs, she watched the horizon come alive with light. The colors shifted and danced, painting the sky in endless variations of brilliance. It was breathtaking, a perfect metaphor for hope and resilience. For years, she had feared moving forward, terrified that doing so would mean leaving Richard behind. But now, standing here, she realized the opposite was true. Moving forward didn't mean forgetting him. It meant honoring him by living fully, fiercely, and with purpose. "You taught me how to fight," she murmured, turning her face toward the breeze. "Now it's my turn to teach others." With that, she turned and began the walk home, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Ahead lay challenges, yes, but also opportunities. A chance to make a difference, to build a future worthy of Richard's sacrifice. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its golden glow over the ocean, Margaret took her first steps into that future. Not alone, but guided by the love and memory of the man who had shown her the power of trust and the strength within herself.